we go. So AT, take it away.
Great. Thanks, JC. And thanks again, everybody, for joining. Hopefully you enjoyed the breakout rooms. Love some feedback on that afterwards. But I think we heard that loud and clear from our first virtual one that people enjoyed that. So definitely, hopefully we enjoyed that there. Thanks again, Lucie, for joining us here. We'll probably spend the next 25 minutes or so jumping in with Lucie around just her background, how she got into healthcare, some of the early days of Rimidi, where that's going now, post-COVID. I think doing a lot of exciting things there. And then just in general, healthcare entrepreneurship in Atlanta, what she's learned and advice she has for other entrepreneurs here. So as JC mentioned, if you have questions, put them in the chat. She will collect them. And at the end, we'll do Q&A that way, where JC will read some of the questions out of the chat. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Lucie, again, thanks for joining. And I think, first place we'll start, I think you're Atlanta native, right? How did you decide to even get into healthcare? When did that cross your mind you wanted to be in healthcare?
So thanks for having me. This is really fun. And so healthcare was sort of a second or third career for me. After college, I went to work for the government, actually in the intelligence field as a physicist, working on mobile communications technologies for some government agencies. And sort of am a science geek at heart, I think. Decided to move back to Atlanta and went to work for a venture capital fund here, actually, as their sort of subject matter expert in that kind of technology. And that was what really sort of made me miss science and realize that I just have this passion around sort of discovery and curiosity and data. But, in a very science geek way, I thought, well, medicine is sort of like science meets people. And I really enjoyed the people part of business and venture capital. And so decided that, that's what I would do, was go into healthcare, and actually really intended to be an academic clinician, went to Emory, did the dual MD, PhD, thought I would run a clinical lab and see patients, do research. That was the plan.
Yes, always the plan, and then things will change, right? So I love just that passion, curiosity is something we always see in a lot of successful entrepreneurs, right? So now you go to Emory, got the medicine degree, you mentioned you want to be in academics. How did that sort of transition to actually want to start a business? How did that thought process come about?
Yeah, so then I went on to UPMC up in Pittsburgh for training, and great integrated healthcare delivery system, right? They have a health plan, they're a delivery system, they sort of control half of that market. And I was just shocked at the level of sort of dysfunction and lack of reason and ration in the way that healthcare was actually delivered and billed, and sort of the systems level issues with it. And I think, again, that curiosity got the best of me, that I started asking, well, why do we do it this way? And why does the patient have to do that? And, why do they have to be here 4 hours before surgery when they're just sitting there waiting? And sort of all of these why? It's like, my 4-year-old now. So, and I just got really fixated on the fact that this whole system, doesn't have good reasons for the way that we do half of what we do. It's, it's not good for the doctor. It's not good for the patient. It's not good for the family. It's not really good for anybody. It's not good for the health insurers. And found that my colleagues, I think, just had a lot more patience than I did, right? The passion that people bring to patient care, and sort of this calling that is to be a nurse or a doctor, or, deliver care. And therefore this willingness to put up with a really broken system because you care so deeply about the mission. And I, love that and respect that, but said to my colleagues, well, I'm glad you feel that way, because this is going to make me crazy, and I'm going to go try to do something about it.
Yeah. So to that point, how do you take knowing that there are lots of things broken in healthcare?
Yeah.
How did you start to say, these are parts of the problem that I want to go specifically try and tackle?
Yeah, so I actually went from clinical medicine back sort of to the venture side, helping a group that was raising a fund, and they needed somebody who really understood healthcare. And that gave me visibility into looking at a bunch of healthcare innovation. And, the opinion I formed was that part of the problem with a lot of technology in healthcare is that they don't have that end user perspective, whether that's a clinician or a patient or an administrator. But
Mhm.
so many of the deals we were looking at, technology options, lacked that. So that was one piece. And then as a clinician, I really had no understanding of the cost centers in healthcare, right? They don't teach you that in medical school of like, we spend X% of GDP on healthcare. And of that, we spend, this huge amount on chronic disease, for instance. So that's how I ended up focusing on chronic disease, as I was just, horrified by what a terrible job we do of managing chronic diseases. And that didn't seem very logical to me.
Sure. So as you start to focus on, hey, chronic disease, how did you think about, well, great, I see these problems, I've lived some of them and know some of them. How do I try and go start a business to tackle it? How did you think through that? Like, is this an idea I want to go pursue?
Yeah. So, I think this idea around, why can't we use data to help drive decision making, right? For a patient or for a doctor. And I say that in part because in my sort of career in medicine, every hospital I worked at went live with their electronic health record for the first time, made that paper to electronic transition. And I think that made a big impact on me because I was like, wow, the promise of digitizing data and what we'll do with all that data once it's digitized. And then the reality of what those, products were actually like for a doctor or nurse or clerk to use. So I sort of had this concept of like, gosh, there's so much more opportunity there if we have all this digital data to help, solve some problems that computers are really good at and humans are really bad at, right? Of, in the moment, absorbing a bunch of data, comparing it to a set of rules and guidelines and making a very individualized decision about a patient. Like, we humans aren't actually that great at doing that on the fly. So that was sort of the why, why technology, why software, and, chronic disease patients have a lot more data, right? Something like diabetes, which is why I decided to start the company. I just sort of started digging into that, and we've been asking patients to, monitor their blood sugar at home for decades, and it seemed no benefit. And why is that? Well, because we didn't really have a mechanism to use the data they were generating.
Mm-hmm. So that's great. So tell me about that. One of the things we always hear from entrepreneurs, right, is that customer discovery process of, right, you've got an idea, you have a hypothesis. How do you go start talking to potential customers, in this case, whether it be patients or the clinical administrators, of help me better understand that problem. How did you go about that customer discovery, and what did you learn that sort of evolved your view of what the company could be?
Yeah, so, I think the different constituencies like you're talking about. So I went out and talked to researchers on papers where they had done this in, grant-funded studies. And I think that's one of the problems in medicine is we prove really amazing, outcomes in some of these academic type studies, and then they never make the transition over to commercial products and the market that can scale and help a lot of people. So, I found some of the studies that had really looked at doing this and went and talked to the PI on the study and said, tell me about this. Like, why did this end when the grant ran out, right? Just to sort of validate that, there's something there that could really help patients and clinicians. Went and talked to some patient advocacy groups about it as well. And the rub, I think one of the big challenges in healthcare is really the business model side, right? Who's going to pay for it? And so that's where I probably had to spend the most of my time on customer discovery. This was early days of accountable care organizations, when the first, I think, 32 pioneer ACOs started, and who even knew what that meant, right? So that was the longest part of the process, right? What's the business model? Who's going to pay? Do the clinicians pay? Do the payers need to pay? Does the employer pay?
And so coming out of that, what did you learn, or how did you sort of pivot from, my initial idea was this, and I learned and went down another path?
Yeah. I think one thing I had to decide is what part of the market did I feel like I could impact, right? And my passion was really about impacting clinical decision-making and clinical management of these diseases. And as I looked at the market, there were a lot of people focusing at that time and continued now on, consumer-facing applications. How do I, help an individual with lifestyle change, with adherence to taking their medication, with sort of different aspects of self-management. And I felt like that's needed, that's super important, but it's not the problem I want to solve, right? And there are folks doing that. Same thing with employer-based healthcare, and we actually now sort of in the era of COVID see that making a resurgence, but spent a lot of time talking to employers to determine that, like, they're not really in the business of healthcare, right? If, I'm a carpet manufacturer or, chicken processing plant, whatever, even if I have healthcare on site, like, I'm really not in the business of delivering healthcare. I'm in the business of trying to, manage cost around healthcare, most sort of crassly. So I love that market. And as I said, we're sort of coming back to talking to them during COVID about that market, but it just wasn't ready, right? Employers, even self-insured employers, weren't ready to take on primary care and clinical management of their employees' health. So that sort of led me back to, the market we needed to serve was, healthcare systems, clinics, really engaging with clinicians about how they manage patients and sort of going B to B to C to get to their patients through those health systems.
Love that story of, hey, we were testing a bunch of different avenues, and this is the challenge that is part of healthcare, right? It is very important to focus on one of those areas versus trying to cover all of them, right? So now you've got the idea of, hey, we've narrowed it down, focused on the clinical aspect of this to go sort of, B to B to C as you're describing. Now what's the next step? How do you go start to test and say, how do I get some of my first customers or get people trying this or get an MVP built? How do you think about the next steps once you'd start to zone in on your focus area?
Yeah, so we, once we sort of decided that's where, we needed to focus, if we really wanted to be in the business of impacting clinical management and decision-making, we, had to focus on the clinical part of the market. So then, as you said, it was like, who can we find who will actually implement this? And, even when I was still, quote, selling the PowerPoint version, right? And I'm a huge fan of doing that, which is, I think, especially for sort of scientists and clinicians, immensely uncomfortable at first when you're sort of way out over your skis saying, here's this product, let me show you the PowerPoint, in the back of your mind, you're like, and we have 8 more weeks of development before I could possibly deploy this anywhere. But, it's just the reality. The sales cycles are so long in healthcare. If I had any idea, I probably would have never started this business. But, we found an ACO who believed in our vision. They're still a client today. I was on the phone with them last night. So, I've probably known them for 6 years now. And they've gotten to be very dear friends of mine. But they said yes, right? And so then we had to scramble and be like, oh my gosh, somebody actually said yes. What does that mean? How do we do this?
Yeah. So that's great. Getting those first ones, like you said, are always hard. And again,
Yeah.
I love the idea of hey, sell it on a PowerPoint first to get the feedback before you're spending a lot of money building them. I think that's one of the things I see a lot of times entrepreneurs feel they have to go spend all this money and raise all this money to go build this thing and then try and sell it versus convincing themselves that there's something real there. So now you got early customer using it. How do you start thinking about now, well, great, how do I go from 1 to 5, 5 to 10, start to get enough of those customers and really hone in on that value prop? You can then go scale and start repeating.
Yeah. And I think part of it is, a challenge that certainly looking back then and now is you can't be everything to everybody, right? And so as we were, out in the market, I sort of mentioned this nexus where we wanted to focus on sort of using patient data and electronic health record data to help drive decision making. Well, there are whole companies who do one piece of that and might do one piece of that better than us. And so I always found that difficult to manage. There's a company called Gluco in diabetes that all they do is interface with all the devices out in the market that patients have, glucometers and pumps, and they do that piece really, really well. Like, that's their niche. And so, when you run into a competitor that the market is like, well, we want what you have plus what they have. Like, why can't you do all that stuff they do too, right? And support 89 different glucometers. So we sort of having to navigate through that and being true to what's really unique about what the value we provide, and not being distracted or threatened by something a competitor does that's sort of adjacent, that, at some point you just have to say to the prospect, look, if that's the most important thing to you to solve for that, you probably need to use them. If, the analytics and decision support and everything else that we do is what's most important to you, then you should choose us. So that was hard for me to get there and feel comfortable sort of being that frank, right, with a prospect of, this is what we do it really well. If you want to buy it, fantastic. But we don't do all those other things.
Right. Well, I love the focus that brings, right? Because I see that a lot, right? That I'll talk to an entrepreneur that says, well, I've got to have these 35 features before I can launch my MVP, right?
Yeah.
Or the first product, because that's what everybody else has in the market. And to your point, I love how you framed it of, hey, what are we really uniquely good at? And how do we sell that part of the value? And that means saying no to other things, and that's okay, right?
And in response to your question about scaling, one thing we found after sort of starting a bunch of different, pilots or, early engagements, is we hit this wall in terms of scaling as far as integration to their electronic health record. And, a small group was willing to use a standalone software system to scale it across their whole health system. There just wasn't going to be sort of tolerance for that in terms of, inefficiency of having to go to a separate place and log in. And that was a really hard problem to solve when I first started the company. We would have had to do traditional HL7 interfaces to EMRs, and I really didn't have the team to do that or any interest in doing that. And so one of my long-term mentors, had been talking to me about FHIR and APIs and how sort of important that was going to be to the healthcare market. So we took just a huge bet on that. When I joked with him of like, that nobody on the health system side has any idea what I'm talking about. If I go and tell them that we're going to be a FHIR-enabled app, and for those who might be on the call who don't know what FHIR is, it's FHIR, and it's sort of the standard API that HL7 has adopted and that the healthcare sector has broadly adopted today in 2020. 2015, like not so much, right? It was sort of academic and policy folks were talking about it, but Piedmont Healthcare, Emory Healthcare, like they didn't know what we were talking about. So we took a bet on that. It made sense, and spent like a year and a half of dev time really working on that and getting approved on the marketplace as a partner of these EHRs. And that was a big bet because like nobody ran and bought our product just because we did that in the first year or two afterwards. But it's turned out to be a good bet for us.
Yeah. So as you start to do that ramping up a little bit, like one of the questions I always get is, well, how do I ramp up my team? Do I go hire salespeople first, or technologists first, or in healthcare medical folks first? And obviously you have some of the medical expertise, but like, how did you think about the skill sets you needed as you started to ramp up and grow the team?
Yeah, I mean, we have been, I think, the sort of anti-Silicon Valley on that, right? I mean, just knowing our access to capital, part of it being based in Atlanta, part of it being a first-time entrepreneur. I just didn't see that I was going to go like raise $10 million and figure out what to do with it. So we've been pretty scrappy of, sort of hiring to the need. I had a salesperson early on who, serial entrepreneur, and was great at that early stage of cold calling and pitching when you don't really know exactly what your value proposition and product market fit is. And he was perfect for that period in time. And then we've sort of built a tech team here in Atlanta, but with some flexibility where they're not all full-time employees for a long time, that gave us, made us remain really lean on that side.
Cool. And then as part of that, growing and scaling, one of the questions we always see too is, should I raise money or not in that process? So maybe spend a minute to talk about, how did you think about, should we raise money, and what we were looking for, and how that fit into your growth?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, with the long sales cycles and, really having to figure out this, product market fit, if like we needed to raise money to have the runway to get there in terms of product development. And I didn't even mention that early on, it, seemed that we would have to go through the FDA for some of the features of our software before they had developed pathways for sort of more clarity around software, that it's not always a medical device and a 510K. And so we had that uncertainty early. So we did decide to raise money. I really wanted investors who were sort of aligned with my mission and the problem we were trying to solve. So I had the really great fortune of our first money being from a social impact venture fund. And that really had a big impact on our trajectory, because it sort of opened up that network to us, and they've been tremendously helpful and have made follow-on investments. So our seed round had some angels and social impact type funds, as well as Cox Enterprises here in Atlanta invested. And I really didn't want the pressure of true venture coming in early with some of the things that brings with it, right? We just weren't ready for that. We weren't ready for someone to say, pour a bunch of money in, and either you fail fast or, I knew we had some time that we needed to continue to figure out what our product market fit was. So we raised money from them for the seed round. And then by the time we had kind of done all this work on positioning ourselves as, a FHIR-enabled app, we're going to overlay the EMR, and sort of distinguish ourselves that way. That actually brought us in front of Eli Lilly. They were looking for a technology to help them with some workflow aspects of the insulin sort of system they're developing. They and all the other insulin manufacturers, right, want to get into this digital space and have connected insulin pens and apps that go with that, which I think they're very well positioned to do. Except, how does that get prescribed? How does that data flow from the doctor's office to the patient and back to the doctor? And so they approached us, we formed a partnership, and then they ended up leading our Series A, which was really nice. And that's what we wanted to do, right? It was the right thing for us to sort of have more strategic money and mission-driven money than typical venture money.
Well, that sounds like a key theme, like exactly what you just said, right? Somebody who was a great partner with you, that got it, understood it, and could help push you forward in there versus just raising money.
Yeah.
Love
yeah,
that.
and whoever you raise money from, right? It needs to be a culture fit, and there needs to be alignment of mission and strategy, and that's just different for every company.
Sure. So let me fast forward a little bit now, as I know we probably got like five minutes here. So this is great. So now COVID hits the world, right? And you're already doing some things around remote patient monitoring and other things. How does this accelerate and or change the strategy for Rimidi going forward? And what are you seeing as opportunities there?
Yeah, it has been a crazy couple of months. So, right. So a big part of our business is enabling remote monitoring of these chronic diseases and sort of bringing that, virtualizing care and then bringing that data into the workflow. As you fast forward, we now do that across a bunch of disease states, not just diabetes. So, cardiovascular, hypertension, obesity, liver disease, et cetera. So COVID has definitely accelerated that remote patient monitoring world, in part because the government has at least temporarily fixed some of the reimbursement models around that, opening it up to more practices. And so we've seen an explosion of, interest, right, in telemedicine and remote virtual care. And then on the other hand, back in February, we also, sort of said, what can we do around COVID? And we had been slated to release a patient-reported outcomes product like in June. So in, second week of February, maybe the last week of February, I said to my dev team, so like, could we take that and release it in 2 weeks and make it a COVID product, right? I know it's going to be ready in 4 months, but could it be ready in 2 weeks? And could you make it a COVID product instead? And they did an amazing job, and we got a product out on March 15th to help health systems sort of automate the triage of patients, right? So if I have patients coming into clinic for an appointment, I want to know before they're standing at the desk filling out a questionnaire whether or not they have symptoms consistent with COVID or if they've been exposed to somebody. So we really scrambled, and they did a great job of developing that. And then we just last week released sort of a full platform product for tracking both symptom reporting and testing, right? All of the COVID test results. And last night I was talking with the system about using it for contact tracing as well. So it's been a lot of fun, but it's been a pretty busy couple months.
That's great. That's fantastic. That's one of the things I always find fascinating about, entrepreneurs in the early stage, right, is you have the ability to quickly do some of those things and pivot and capture that a larger company just may take longer to get around to changing. So I love that you can adapt and tackle some of those. One more question here, just sort of, and then we'll sort of wrap up and go to Q&A. As you sort of look forward, sort of what's the next stage of Rimidi? You mentioned you found some partners that are great fits for you. You're getting lots of opportunities, that there's some tailwinds in the market you're going after. What's sort of the next phase of growth for Rimidi look like?
Yeah. I always think about, how do we take friction out of the process, right? Out of, if it's our customers, how do we make it easier for them to, buy our product, use our product? And now I think with this focus on virtualization of care, that's a big change, in the day-to-day existence of these practices. And so how can we make that easier for them to make that transition? Because I think we were talking in our breakout group, but that all of us as consumers who've experienced it, right? It's great. It's great to not have to drive to the doctor's office, take a half day off work, sit in the waiting room, all that stuff. If you can have a quick 5-minute, 15-minute video encounter, or just a asynchronous text message or something. So we're going to demand it, right? And there's going to be some pushback from the healthcare provider side because it's just new. So how do companies like ours make that easier for them? And I think we'll focus on, is it by consolidating products and offering them sort of turnkey type solutions?
Great. Well, one last question here, Lucie, and we'll turn over to Q&A. I know JC's gotten some questions already. If you have any other questions, folks, feel free to put them in the chat, and then we can address those in a minute. But being an entrepreneur in Atlanta, in healthcare, any other lessons learned or advice you'd have to entrepreneurs who may be thinking about starting a healthcare business here in
Atlanta? Just don't give up, right? It's a slog, but I think, hard problems are worth solving. So that's sort of our mantra of, there's an easier way to make a living than being a healthcare entrepreneur, but, stay focused on the fact that you're, why you're in it, who you're trying to help, and it's all worth it.
Well, great, Lucie. Thank you so much. Lots of great nuggets in there. And one of the favorite ones I took away, at least from that, was just that focus you did in the discovery process to really hone in where you're going to focus versus trying to be everything and all features to everyone. Really, really love that. JC, I'll turn it back to you. I think a few questions have come in via chat and email.
Sure.
I'll kick it to you for a couple follow-up questions here, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. So one that came in, maybe we'll start with this one. I've got a couple here, but what percentage of healthcare can be delivered remotely, and what is the low-hanging fruit for remote care? And that might be look different now.
Yeah. So again, I'm also sort of a fan of this like crawl, walk, run approach, right? Of we don't need to feel like we need to push all healthcare remotely today, right? And I think that's makes that a great question of what's the low hanging fruit. So we don't need to put diagnostics and full telemedicine kits into the hands of every patient and try to avoid them ever having to come back into the clinic. So that technology is possible, it's out there, but I think sort of the like dermatology has been a great example. There's a lot of teledermatology that's already out there, right? You take a picture, you send it in. A lot of conditions can actually be diagnosed that way in dermatology, and they can use that to triage who needs to be seen in the clinic and who doesn't. Same thing with, bringing a patient in for a blood pressure check or for, some of their basic lab work, right? When you're really seeing a patient to talk about data, then do you really need to see the patient in the clinic, right? Lay hands on them and do a physical exam. So I think about those sort of in-between appointments when you don't need to do an exam and you're having a conversation. Why not virtualize that?
Yeah, excellent. Another one, it's related to COVID. So which healthcare trends during COVID will stay and which will revert back?
So again, I think, for better, for worse, the, reimbursement drives a lot of behavior in healthcare. And so the fact that sort of some barriers to reimbursement for telemedicine and remote monitoring have been removed during the public health crisis. We're lobbying hard and sort of right now in this moment, because there's, one of these days the White House is going to declare that the public health emergency is over, and that will then end a lot of those exceptions and waivers that have been going on for the past few months that have fixed longstanding problems with reimbursement for both telemedicine and remote monitoring and access issues. So we're lobbying Congress, and if anyone wants to sign on to that bandwagon, send me a private message and I'll loop you in, because I think it's really important, right? And some of those are access issues, right? Making sure that federally qualified health centers, rural health clinics, folks like that can offer telemedicine. And I think one thing I'd love to see out of this crisis is that we leverage what we've seen in terms of health disparities and how COVID has more heavily affected medically underserved and minority communities, and we've needed to shine a spotlight on that for a long time. So virtualized care, telemedicine has a really important role to play in those underserved communities, and if we can leverage this moment to try to fix some of the barriers to that, it would be a great win out of a bad situation.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I'm going to pop around a little bit, but one question here as far as legal challenges go. So we have, what is the biggest legal challenges for your startup? Do you have a GC on your staff to advise your company? Did they start with you full time? Did you outsource? Tell us maybe a little bit about that.
So we do, sort of unusually have a GC on our staff. And she manages, right, there's a lot of complexity in healthcare startups, right? All of the HIPAA compliance, as well as product liability, as well as I mentioned early on, sort of FDA and regulatory status. So that's been, I think, really important to help us get that right. And then as you succeed, it brings bigger challenges. So we've been audited by a lot of really big companies at this point in terms of sort of product audit, HIPAA audit, and Price Waterhouse and CVS and Eli Lilly. And that's a really painful process. It would be really painful if you didn't have somebody who sort of is, paid to make sure the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed and all the policies are in place. So it's been very helpful.
Yeah.
Great. JC, maybe last question, and then I'll wrap up here.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll try and get one here. How would your program help a healthcare coach, and what would be the cost of a person to use it?
Yeah, so I think, again, a role that we would like to see pushed virtual is some of this, health education, health coaching. It's a result of the attention that's been brought to virtualization of care due to COVID. And so we do have some like diabetes educators and other health coaches who are interested in that, and they're welcome to, I'll put my email on the chat to everybody, and anyone who wants to follow up is welcome just to send me an email and I can take those offline.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That's so helpful.
Great. Well,
I'll share my screen. How's that?
Yeah. Well, just a couple upcoming dates to wrap up, and then we'll close here. So again, on our website, JC will show you the link here in a minute. We've got resources for those who are in health IT, and you can see any of our upcoming meetups that we have, any area events that are going on, and then any healthcare companies. We're happy to list you on our site here as well. I know Berkeley was on the call earlier. They have an event tonight around social determinants of health, if anybody can join that. And then the other big one I want to flag coming up July 30th. So we'll start publicizing this in about a week or so, is we're putting together, working with TAG Digital Health and Georgia HIMSS around calling the Georgia Healthcare Innovation Challenge. And this is the idea. We're partnered with Navicent Health out of Macon and Middle Georgia, where they are going to be presenting two problems that they are actively trying to solve and haven't found the right solutions yet. Sharing those with this community. whether it be an entrepreneur, an existing company, a vendor who may have something, and going through a 12 to 13 week process where folks will submit proposals to pitch against those solutions that they're trying to solve. They'll down to select to some finalists, and at the end have a forward pitch event back where they will select a winner to move forward to solve their challenges. So this is an exciting event. Lots more to be posted here in the next week or two, but if you want to hold that date, July 30th, 5:30 to 7, it was hopefully to be at the Tech Village live, but we're planning for virtual, and we can adjust the other way if necessary, but more to come in the next week or two. But definitely hold that date. I think it should be a good opportunity for the community to see some real problems and exposure to that, as well as just connect further. So with that, I'll sort of close here. Again, thank you, Lucie. Great stories. Appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Thank you, everybody who joined the meetup. Hopefully this was helpful. We always look for feedback, so feel free to send myself or JC any feedback to how we can improve these. But thanks again so much. Everyone have a great day and a great week.
Bye, thanks.